In a quiet funeral hall, Yoon Sul stood beside the memorials of her deceased parents, grief weighing heavily upon her. Tears streamed down her face as she mourned their loss, her heart clinging to her only remaining family, her grandfather. He had been her anchor since her parents' tragic passing, shielding her and becoming her sole family. Yoon Sul had vowed to dedicate her life to making him happy. However, she had recently learned a heartbreaking truth: her grandfather was in the late stages of pancreatic cancer, his days numbered. With his remaining time, he had one request: to see her married before he passed away. Marriage was the last thing on Yoon Sul's mind. She was too young and it felt rushed. Yet, her grandfather's deep concern for her future left her feeling obligated to consider it. At college, Yoon Sul approached Sak-yoon, her carefree and charming friend, who usually brightened her spirits. An idea sparked in her mind, and she abruptly dragged him outside the classroom. Once alone, she hesitated before blurting out a shocking question to Sak-yoon: would he marry her? Sak-yoon froze, momentarily stunned, before breaking into a wide grin. He playfully accepted, acknowledging the suddenness but adding with a laugh that he couldn't refuse such a proposal. He suggested they marry when they turned 30. Yoon Sul began to explain her situation, but his phone rang, interrupting her. A friend invited him to meet some pretty girls nearby. Sokyun's grin widened at the invitation, exclaiming it sounded fun and suggesting they continue their conversation tomorrow. He waved goodbye, pinching her cheeks and saying he knew she was kidding anyway, although he confessed his heart had been pounding. He then left the campus, leaving Yoon Sul watching his retreating figure, a tightness in her chest. Frustration bubbled up as she muttered to herself, questioning what she had done and what she had expected from someone who was never serious. She wondered if he could take her seriously even once, and if her expression hadn't been serious enough. Lost in her thoughts, Yoon Sul bumped into someone. Startled, she looked up and hastily apologized. The man, with an icy demeanor, interrupted her apology, telling her to pay attention to where she was walking next time and not to daydream. Irritated by his tone, Yoon Sul retorted that if he saw her daydreaming, he could have avoided her instead of walking right into her on purpose. Before he could respond, a car sped dangerously close to Yoon Sul. In a swift movement, the man grabbed her arm and pulled her to safety. The force of the pull caused her to crash into his chest, their faces so close that their lips accidentally brushed. Time seemed to stand still for a moment. Realizing what had happened, the man quickly released her, and Yoon Sul stumbled back, her face turning crimson. He coldly brushed off his sleeve, stating not to get the wrong idea: the car was speeding, and he only pulled her to safety. She stammered a thank you, straightening herself and avoiding his gaze, suggesting they pretend none of it happened and that they were both having a bad day. Before she could leave, his amused voice stopped her, questioning if she wasn't even going to thank him for saving her life. His lips curled into a teasing smirk, and with a mischievous glint in his eyes, he asked if she planned to leave without compensating him for that kiss. Yoon Sul, still flustered, retorted that it wasn't a kiss, their lips barely touched, and not to act like it was a big deal. With sarcasm, she asked if he had never been kissed before. The man smirked back, asking what made her think that and suggesting she looked more like someone who had never kissed anyone. Irritated, Yoon Sul shot back, asking what was so special about him and that she didn't even remember kissing him. His smirk deepened as he teased that people usually don't forget their first kiss so easily. Her anger flared at his tone, and she called him delusional, declaring that he was the 108th person she had kissed, so he should forgive her if it wasn't memorable. With that, she spun around, sharply adding that he should not talk to her if he saw her again, calling him a perverted guy. He stood watching her storm off, amusement dancing in his eyes, muttering the 108th, huh? Interesting, a faint grin lingering as he watched her disappear. Back in class, Yoon Sul sat distracted, while her friends laughed and chatted around her, discussing parties and outings. She could hardly focus, her mind replaying her encounter with Sak-yoon and the icy man. Sak-yoon, the life of the group, bantered with others, his carefree smile lighting up the room. Suddenly, the professor walked in, silencing the chatter and announcing in a serious tone that they had a special guest lecturer who would be joining them for the next semester. He introduced himself in a calm, steady voice as Kag Janang. Yuns froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. She clutched her notebook tightly, her face a mixture of shock and mortification. Her mind screamed that he was the annoying person from yesterday. Her cheeks burned as she ducked lower in her seat. Her panic escalated as his eyes scanned the classroom. She ducked further behind her notebook, whispering to herself if she was seeing things wrong and hoping she was mistaken. Suddenly, his voice rang out, sharp and clear, cutting through the chatter, singling her out. He addressed the person clutching the book, asking for her name. Startled, Yuns froze, stammering that she was Choi Yun-lol, trying to steady her voice. A playful smirk tugged at his lips as Mr. Kong began smoothly, remarking he never knew biting a book could help absorb its content. The class erupted into laughter, and Yun-sul's face turned crimson. Before she could recover, his smirk deepened, and he casually flipped a page, asking why she didn't explain page 108. Her heart skipped a beat at the deliberate pause before his next words. "Oh," he added, his tone laced with mischief, "it was his mistake, he meant page 10. 8. His eyes sparkled with amusement as he continued, urging Miss Choi to enlighten them. His smirk widened, clearly enjoying her discomfort. As class ended, Surin casually greeted Professor Kong, asking why he hadn't mentioned he would be teaching there. She asked him to have a coffee. Kong Jong's expression remained polite but distant as he replied that he had something to take care of after this and that it wasn't appropriate for a professor and student to have coffee together. Oh, Surin, one of the classmates, asked if she knew him. Surprised, Surin replied nonchalantly that their families knew each other. Later, Ganangun, Yunseo's friend, suggested lunch craving jjajangmyeon, but Yun-sul declined, saying she would head straight home as she was tired, offering a weak smile. Walking through the hallway, she noticed Kong Junyoung ahead of her. Gathering her courage, she called out to Mr. Kong to ask if they could talk. He stopped for a moment and turned his sharp gaze, locking onto hers. She began hesitantly, apologizing for how their first meeting went and asking if they could keep their issue out of class. He asked, his tone unreadable, if she didn't remember him. His smirk returned, a hint of amusement in his eyes, stating he never brought personal issues into his class, acting as a professor who advises his students. His voice dipped slightly, carrying a hint of sarcasm as he told her not to be arrogant. Her mouth opened in shock, but no words came out. As he turned and walked away, she stood there, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Later that evening, back in her apartment, Yun-sul's phone buzzed. It was her grandfather calling. She answered quickly. Her grandfather cheerfully asked how Yun-seol was doing. She replied she was good and asked about him. He said he was doing well and told her he would be in the city this Saturday to meet an old friend's son and that she should join them. She agreed as she didn't have any plans. He said great and that he would pick her up, saying see you, and then the call ended, leaving her staring at her phone. The next day arrived with a crispness in the air, and Yun-sul found herself accompanying her grandfather to a luxurious estate. Keg Tae-jin, her grandfather, called out with warmth as the host approached, teasing that the owner of such a large company shouldn't need to personally greet guests at the front gate. Yun-seol's grandfather teased lightly, but Kang Tae-jin replied chuckling that he had to come out because he wanted to meet this young lady. As she bowed politely, her grandfather introduced her to Kang Tae-jin and his wife Hak, explaining they were the children of his late friend Kag Dogwo, also close friends with her parents and the owners of TJ Corporation. Yun-sul said it was lovely to meet them with a warm smile. Tae-jin warmly said she had grown into such a beautiful young lady. Hak added, motioning them inside towards the grand entrance. As they walked, Tae-jin said that her family had contributed so much to his and without them, TJ Corporation wouldn't be where it was today. Her grandfather interjected, waving off the compliment. As they entered the home, Tae-jin sighed, his voice tinged with guilt, telling Yun-sul he regretted not reaching out after her parents' passing and that he should have. Ha-suk gently cut him off, her tone soft and comforting, suggesting they not bring up something so heavy now. Tae-jin quickly shifted the mood with a warm smile, telling Yun-sul that if she was willing, she could consider herself part of their family, and he would be thrilled to finally have a daughter, maybe even a younger sibling and an older brother for his kids. Hae-sik shook her head with a playful smile, telling Tae-jin he was going to embarrass her and that he had always wanted a daughter and was now jumping at the chance. Tae-jin turned, gesturing with pride, saying oh, there was their second son, Jenseo, and told him to say hello. The young man bowed politely, saying nice to meet her, and introduced himself as Kong Jenseo. As they continued chatting, the sound of confident footsteps echoed down the hallway. Everyone turned just as the firstborn son entered the room. The air grew tense for a moment as Yoon Sol locked eyes with none other than Kong Junyoung, the man who had saved her from that speeding car just days ago. Her eyes widened in shock, and both of them froze, their eyes locking in disbelief at the sheer unexpectedness of the moment. Junyoung broke the silence, remarking that fate really had a sense of humor, his voice laced with amusement. Yunseo took a deep breath, trying to suppress her irritation. She decided to start over, thanking him for saving her life, her tone polite but guarded. Junyoung's eyes glinted with mischief as he replied, "Oh, she had said she didn't remember, but now it seems she did, remembering the kiss." Yoon Sol interrupted sharply, her face heating up, stating there was no need for details and yes, she remembered everything, sir, adding the last word with an awkward smile. He chuckled softly, agreeing that apart from class, they could forget the sir. Yunseo straightened her posture and shook her head, stating she couldn't just call him Jen-young as he was older and clearly much more experienced. His smirk widened at this, questioning if by experienced she meant first kiss experience, adding that he couldn't compare to her as she had done it 108 times. Her face burned red, and as she stammered, glaring at him, he chuckled, unbothered, asking if he was right, Miss Choi. Her frustration boiled over, calling him impossible and stating that because of her grandfather and his parents, she was trying to be civil, but him. She jabbed her finger towards him and warned him to be careful outside because they didn't know each other, understanding? With a casual shrug, he replied that was exactly what he wanted, no need to pretend to be nice. Leaning slightly closer, he added that it didn't suit him anyway. As he turned to leave, Yunseo stood frozen, her fists clenched as irritation simmered within her. Back at college, Yunseo confided in her friend, revealing that she was looking for a potential partner to marry and had even proposed to Seok-yoon. Shocked, her friend exclaimed how Yoon Sol could just marry anyone like that. She then scolded Yoon Sol, saying she needed someone mature and established, not just anyone. Suddenly, her friend's expression brightened as an idea struck her. She knew her aunt ran a matchmaking business and suggested arranging a blind date for Yoon Sol without waiting for a response, adding decisively that she would set it up for this Saturday. On Saturday, at a hotel, Yoon Sol sat waiting for her matchmaking partner to arrive. When he finally appeared, he introduced himself politely but soon began rambling endlessly about his own good looks. The following Saturday, she met another man who was overly cautious about diet and wouldn't even let her eat freely. As the weeks went by, Yoon met various men. Some were overly bold, hitting on her directly, while others believed in ghosts and shared unsettling, scary stories. It was becoming clear to her just how difficult it was to find a suitable match. However, one Saturday, she met a man who seemed genuine. As she entertained the thought, she accidentally dropped her teacup. The man quickly offered her his handkerchief, a small gesture that sparked a glimmer of hope within her that perhaps there was still a chance to find a decent man at the same hotel. On the other side, Jinan sat in a chair, arguing over the phone with his mother, questioning why she made promises without consulting him first, his tone laced with irritation. His mother calmly explained it wasn't her friend wanted to introduce her daughter to him after seeing how well his company was performing. As soon as the call ended, someone called his name. A young woman stood in front of him, smiling brightly. Remembering his mother's words, Jin-young regarded her with a serious expression and asked if she looked familiar and if they had met before. The girl smiled brightly and replied yes, they had met last year at Prince Ivan's birthday party. Without waiting for a response, she began rambling about how she could help him expand his business by leveraging her connection with the prince. Jin-young listened, growing visibly annoyed with her relentless chatter. Finally, he stood up and said politely it was nice meeting her, but he had some work to attend to and should get going. The girl quickly suggested that she had arrived at an inconvenient time and offered to leave first. As she walked toward the exit, Jin-young let out a sigh and sat back in his chair, relieved to finally have some peace. On the other side of the hotel, Yoonul's meeting seemed to be going well as they engaged in conversation, and the man started politely asking about her family. However, his tone shifted when he revealed he had spent 30 million just to meet someone on her level. Young Seal was taken aback, her shock evident on her face. Noticing her reaction, the man suddenly grabbed her hand and said not to lie to him as he knew people like her, low class and desperate. He told her to follow him to the room or he would report her. Her anger flared and she retorted to report her to the police as she was not afraid. Just then, a familiar voice echoed through the air. Jin Young, who was passing by, stopped in his tracks. The man continued, ignoring her defiance, saying if she wanted money, he could help her get it quickly. Yan Sale clenched her teeth, trying to control her temper. Before the man could say more, his hand was firmly grabbed by someone else. Startled, Yoon Seo looked up, only to see Jin Young standing there, glaring at the man with an icy expression. His grip tightened, causing the man to wince and stumble backward in pain without a word. Jin Young grabbed Yoonul's hand and swiftly led her out of the scene. Struggling to keep up with his pace, Yoonul stumbled behind him. She thanked him, saying she didn't know what would have happened if he hadn't been there, breathlessly glancing down at her hand and adding that he could let go now, Jinan. He released her hand and asked if she was there for a blind date. Irritated, she replied that whatever it was none of his business. Jun Young turned to her and with a smirk remarked that judging by how she was dressed, it must have been a date unless what that guy said was true. Her face flushed, and she quickly denied it. She sat down on a nearby chair with a sigh, taking a deep breath and explaining that her grandfather was ill and this was his last wish, to see her married. Her friend's aunt ran a matchmaking agency, so she had decided to try this. In Young's expression grew serious as he questioned if marriage and love were truly every woman's dream, and if going on blind dates like this was acceptable. Sighing again, Eunicio replied that it wasn't easy, but she didn't need love for her grandfather's happiness, she only wanted the title of wife. Jin Young stared at her intently, as if deep in thought. She added softly that she had thought the man earlier was a good person and that she could finally make her grandfather's wish come true. Jin Young pulled up a chair beside her, sitting down without a word. He appeared to be calculating something before finally glancing at her and proposing to Choi Yoon-seo, asking her to marry him. Yoon-seo froze for a moment, completely taken aback. A second later, she laughed nervously, assuming he must be joking. His expression remained serious as he reminded her that she had said she wouldn't refuse if someone asked her to marry them. Her laughter faded as she asked why it had to be him. Jin Young leaned forward slightly and calmly explained it was beneficial for both of them. They met each other's criteria, their families knew each other, and her grandfather would be happy if she married him. Suspicious, she asked what he would get out of it. He replied that he needed the status of a husband just as she needed the title of wife. Realization dawned on her, and her eyes widened as she understood he was also there for a blind date. He confirmed, interrupting her thoughts, stating he didn't want to waste his time on blind dates and that if he married someone else, he would have to deal with their feelings, but she only cared about the title, making it convenient for both of them. She looked at him thoughtfully and mumbled that she couldn't imagine them getting married. Then after a pause, she asked if she could have some time to think. With a confident smile, Jin Young replied that was fine, he would give her 3 days, and on the third day, at 5 in the afternoon, she should meet him at the parking lot where they first met. If she didn't show up, it would mean she was rejecting his offer. 3 days later, at the parking lot, Jin Young stood waiting. As promised, he glanced at his watch, it was 4:50 p.m. His eyes scanned the quiet, empty path ahead. Minutes ticked by, and he checked the time again, it was now 5:10 p.m. Disappointed, he unlocked his car door, thinking to himself what he had even been expecting by coming here. Just as he was about to get into the car, someone called out his name. He turned to see Yoon Sol running towards him, slightly out of breath. She apologized for being late, panting that her class had ended later than expected. John's expression remained serious as he replied that she was 10 minutes late. Still trying to catch her breath, she responded that she was there to accept his offer, but she had one condition. She straightened herself and looked at him firmly, stating she wanted this marriage to stay a secret, at least until she graduated, as he was quite popular on campus, and if it got out, it could be a disaster for her. Jin Young's lips curled into a faint smile as he nodded, agreeing very well. He extended his hand for a handshake and said in that case, "It was nice working with her, Miss Choi." But he suddenly pulled her forward, and she stumbled into his arms. He held her steady, his grip firm. Startled, she placed her hands on his chest, pushing against him, exclaiming what he was doing, just hugging her like that. With a smirk, he leaned in slightly and said, "Well, weren't they a couple now and they should start looking like one?" At the Kong mansion, during dinner, The atmosphere grew tense as everyone turned their attention to Jun Young, who announced he had some news to share with a steady expression, stating he was going to marry Choi Yoon-seo. His father's face lit up with happiness, exclaiming that Mr. Choi's granddaughter? That was wonderful news. In contrast, Mrs. Kang's expression clouded with concern. His father nodded approvingly, saying he had a feeling about this when they visited them, but he wasn't sure. Jin Young responded calmly that they had been dating for quite some time, but he hadn't known their parents were acquainted. Mrs. Kang interrupted, her voice firm yet restrained, asking how long they had been in a relationship, as he was only teaching at her campus last week, and if this marriage decision wasn't a bit rushed. Jun Young met her gaze evenly and replied that they had been dating long before he started teaching at her campus. He simply hadn't told her, he replied smoothly. Then with a faint smile, he added that was why he disliked it when she pushed him into blind dates with her friends' daughters, and not to worry, mother, he was marrying Yan Sale because he loved her. Mrs. Kang's eyes widened slightly, a wave of panic washing over her as she thought if he even knew what love really was. Irritated, she clenched the fork in her hand tightly, though her expression remained composed with a forced smile, saying, Jin Young, why didn't he bring her here, as she would like to talk to her herself? On the phone, Yoonil was stunned by the news. Worried, she asked Jin Young if his mother got suspicious. Jin Young's tone remained calm as he replied to just stick to the plan, answer everything as they had discussed, and he would wait for her at the usual spot, and not to be late. As the call ended, Yoon Sol stared at her phone, anxiety swirling in her chest, wondering how she was supposed to stay calm. The next day at the Kang house, Mrs. Kang greeted her with a disappointed tone, asking how Jin Young could leave her alone like this. Awkwardly, Yoon Sol responded that he had an urgent matter to attend to, so she came alone. Mrs. Kang studied her for a moment, then said he had already told them about the marriage, but she was still in college. Wasn't this a bit rushed? Yoon-seo straightened her posture and replied firmly that they had decided to keep it a secret until she graduated. Suspicious, Mrs. Kang pressed further, her tone slightly sharp, asking how long they had been dating and why they hadn't informed them earlier. Sensing the tension, Yoon-seo tried to ease her concern, stating they were really serious about this, her voice steady. Mrs. Kang seemed to calm slightly, her expression softening, saying it wasn't that she disliked her, she just had a few questions, thoughtfully looking directly at Yoon Sol, her gaze serious and asking if she really loved her son. Trying her best to appear sincere, Yoonil replied yes, she loved him with all her heart. Mrs. Kang narrowed her eyes and asked again if Jin Young loved her. Yoon Sol froze, her mind racing for an answer to Mrs. Kang's question about Jin Young's love. Before she could respond, Jin Young's familiar voice interrupted, asking his mother if she shouldn't be asking him that question instead. Startled, Yoon Sol turned as Jin Young entered the room, wrapping his arm around her shoulders and pulling her close, trapping her in his embrace. He addressed Mrs. Kang, asserting that he had told her they loved each other and questioned what more he should do to convince her. He looked down at Yoon Sol, a playful smile tugging at his lips, asking his mother if asking Yoon Sol was strange and if she agreed. Awkwardly, Yoon Sol shook her head and replied that no, Mrs. Kang was just worried about him. Mrs. Kang observed the exchange quietly, her worry deepening. As they left the house, Yoon Sol complained to Jin Young, her tone frustrated, asking if he really needed to act like that. Jin Young replied casually, asking how else his mother would believe them. Yoon Sol retorted that he didn't need to hug her. He smirked slightly, saying she should have seen her face when his mother asked those questions, she looked so awkward, especially when he hugged her. She huffed, asking how she couldn't be awkward as they barely knew each other and he hadn't even warned her beforehand. As they reached her home, she muttered a polite thank you and tried to get out of the car, but before she could, Jin Young caught her hand and pulled it to his lips, pressing a kiss to it. He said it seemed like they needed to practice, with a teasing smile. Her eyes widened, and her face turned crimson as she murmured practice, flustered. Yes, practice, he replied, explaining they needed to look like a real couple every chance they got. She yanked her hand away and shot back that no, they didn't need that, she could manage just fine. He teased that she was already confused, just like now. Leaning closer, he hovered over her, his gaze playful, especially when Her face grew even redder as the heat rose to her cheeks. Panicked, she pushed him back, exclaiming she didn't need it before hurriedly getting out of the car. As she was leaving, her phone rang. Seeing it was her grandfather, she answered quickly. On the other end, her grandfather's voice was warm and amused, saying she should have told him earlier, and he would have agreed to her marriage then and there. Hearing his happiness, a smile tugged at her lips, though a pang of nervousness hit her, thinking it was too late to back out now. After the call ended, she turned back toward the car, leaning down through the window, saying, "Well, let's practice then." Inside the car, as she leaned closer to him, she asked hesitantly if they really needed to practice kissing. He glanced at her, his eyes glinting with mischief, and asked what she thought. Without waiting for an answer, he grabbed her by the neck and gently cupped her face. The next second, his lips captured hers. She froze, her eyes wide with shock. As the moment stretched, their kiss deepened, drawing her further into it. After what felt like an eternity, Jin Young pulled back with a small smile, stating that was a wedding kiss, casually brushing his thumb against her lips, and since they were getting married soon, it was only right to practice for it, asking if she didn't think so. Still flustered, she nodded wordlessly and quickly left the car. Inside the car, Jin Young leaned back, rubbing the back of his neck, his cheeks flushed slightly as he replayed what had just happened. The next day at college, as Yoon Sol glanced at her friends, she recalled her conversation with Jin Young about keeping the marriage a secret but asking if she could tell one of her friends as she needed someone to be there for her, to which he had agreed. Looking at her friends now, she hesitated, unsure who to confide in. Later, as she walked with Yan Gun, she gathered her courage and said she needed to talk to her about something. Yan Gun grinned, teasing if she was getting married or something. Awkwardly, Yoon Sol replied, "Actually, yeah." Yeonan froze, her eyes wide in shock, asking who. Not wanting anyone else to overhear, Yoon Sol led her to a quiet spot. Once they were alone, she took a deep breath and said she was going to marry Mr. Kong. Jonan pointed at her accusingly, saying she knew it, she knew something was going on between them. Yoon Sol whispered to keep it down, trying to calm her, and that only Yan Gun knew about this, so please keep it a secret. Her friend nodded and hugged her tightly, congratulating her that she had finally found a way. But after a moment, Yang Yun's smile faded into concern, asking why he was proposing marriage and what his reason was. Yoon Sol decided to be honest, saying he was the same as her, he needed the status and didn't want to waste time. Yan Gun thought for a moment before asking if it could be that he was the one who saved her from all those blind dates. Before Yoon Sol could answer, Yan Gun grinned mischievously, saying he was like her white knight, riding in on a white horse to save the day. As Yan Gun's imagination ran wild, Yoon Sol rolled her eyes, but before she could respond, Sak-yoon appeared behind them, cheerfully asking what they were whispering about, leading them toward the campus cafe to grab some coffee. In the coffee shop, Jin Young sat quietly, sipping his coffee. As he glanced outside, his eyes caught a group of 3 people approaching the cafe, laughing together, his gaze lingering on Yoon Sol, the one person among them he was about to marry. Her bright smile lit up her face, and for a moment, he couldn't tear his eyes away. Suddenly, Surin's voice interrupted his thoughts. Jin Young turned to see Surin standing nearby, greeting her calmly. Surin took a seat beside him with a cheerful smile, saying if she had known he was coming here, she would have joined him earlier, casually. As they chatted, the group entered the cafe. Spotting Surin, Sak-yoon waved enthusiastically, saying Sudge, "Oh, and Mr. Kong is here too," his voice full of surprise. Sak-yoon turned to Jin Young with excitement, saying they were going out to eat and asking if he and Suji would like to join them. Jin Young glanced at Yoon Sol, who was subtly signaling him to decline the invitation. A smirk tugged at his lips as he ignored her silent plea. Turning back to Sak-yoon, he replied okay, he would join. "Great, let's go now," Sak-yoon said, his excitement evident. As they sat in the restaurant, Yoon Sol couldn't shake the discomfort of Jin Young's presence. The atmosphere felt tense, and she couldn't relax. Kyung, as usual, offered Yoon Sol a half-cooked egg, a gesture he always made when they ate together, asking if she liked it and placing it on her plate. Jin Young noticed the gesture, his gaze lingering on them. Noticing his stare, Sak-yoon explained with a cheerful smile that Yoon Sol was from Goj Island and loved eggs on top, it was a thing there. Jin Young smiled lightly, saying he didn't know that and turned to Yoon Sol, asking when she moved to Seoul. Before Yun Sol could answer, Sakyun chimed in again, saying she moved there when college started and before that, she was living in Gaj Island with her grandfather. Yun Sol felt awkward and thought why Sakyun couldn't just shut his mouth. Her thoughts were interrupted when Sakyun took food from her bowl with his chopsticks. Frustrated, she snapped at him not to use his chopsticks in her food and to take all of it now. Surin, observing their exchange, laughed, remarking that they had such a cute bond. Sakyun grinned, putting his arm around Yun Sol's shoulders, saying they were really close friends. Jin Young remained silent, his expression unreadable as he watched the interaction. Yun Sol, however, felt something wasn't right. Jin Young sighed quietly, thinking about how strange the situation felt. After finishing their meal, Sakyun and Surin excused themselves, waving goodbye as they left for their club activities. The remaining three waved back, and Young-un, sensing the tension, spoke up, saying she thought it was better if she headed out too. Yun Sol wanted to leave with her, but before she could, Jin Young grabbed her bag from behind, stopping her. Noticing this, Young-un simply said okay, she would go first. Once the others were gone, Jin Young looked at Yun Sol and said bluntly that she should have told him earlier that she had a boyfriend, or it was uncomfortable for him. Irritated, Yun Sol snapped that he wasn't her boyfriend. She glared at him and added why he had even agreed to come. Jin Young replied calmly that they had agreed to keep their relationship secret on campus, but that didn't mean they didn't know each other, he was just being natural in front of his students. Looking at him, Yun Sol thought how he could stay so calm, even though she knew it wasn't a real marriage. As he started to leave, he commanded her to come with him to the car. Feeling a pang of sadness, she thought what she even expected from someone like Mr. Kong. Suddenly, he extended his hand toward her. Shocked, she asked what he was doing. He replied smoothly that they should practice whenever they had the opportunity, right? She hesitated, staring at him for a moment. Finally, she placed her hand in his as they walked together, hand in hand. She thought that after all, this relationship was supposed to be without feelings, right? Determined, she resolved that if he could be cold, then so could she. When they reached the car, Jin Young opened the door and commented that he noticed she was still uncomfortable holding hands, then with a slight smirk, he added she should be skilled at this by now considering she had kissed 108 times. Yun Sol glared at him, unsure whether to be angry or just let it slide. Deciding there was no harm in following along, she replied simply sorry. Trying to improve, she grabbed his hand again and asked if it was like this, or maybe like that, experimenting with different ways to hold hands, and added which one looked more romantic. Jin Young intertwined his fingers with hers, holding her hand firmly, saying like this, with a steady gaze. Yun Sol looked at him, feeling the warmth of his hand. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond, her heart fluttering despite herself. As Yun Sol chatted with Kwangin, her friend expressed concern about the nature of her marriage, that it was legally binding, but still not real, and asked how long they planned to keep pretending. Kwangin asked seriously. Yun Sol thought to herself that her friend was right, she needed to come up with a plan. She pondered that Jin Young was a successful businessman, it was unlikely he hadn't thought all of this through, but what about her? Was she just going to follow his steps without considering her own? The next day, inside Jin Young's car, she handed him a paper, and he asked what it was, his brow furrowing. It was a letter of agreement, she replied confidently, for him to take one copy. It was a marriage agreement to make sure neither of them was at a disadvantage. Jin Young examined the paper carefully, murmuring that it was correct as he read through the points. The first point, maintaining confidentiality about the marriage, made sense, but marital status would be a better term, it was clearer that way. He glanced at her. He said he didn't have a problem with the first point, but if she was telling one of her friends, he would tell one of his. Moving on. He read the second point, behaving appropriately, saying he was okay with this one too. Then he got to the third point, personal lives are separate, he read aloud. Before he could comment, she interrupted, saying yes, they weren't actually married, so they were free to do as they pleased. He smirked, raising an eyebrow, asking if she meant she could go out with her boyfriend. Her glare sharpened, saying it wasn't like that. His eyes twinkled mischievously as he continued reading, saying he disagreed with the fourth point, suddenly, asking how their families would believe them if they weren't affectionate in front of them. She explained firmly that it didn't have to be all the time and he needed to inform her beforehand. He shook his head, saying that wasn't practical, they would need to improvise, but she countered that they weren't going to meet often, to which he leaned back casually, dropping a bombshell, saying he forgot to mention, after they were married, his mother wanted them to stay at the family house until she graduated. It was one of her conditions. Her eyes narrowed and she asked if he was telling her this now. Ignoring her irritation, he continued that was why points 4 and 5 should be removed. As for point 0. 6, he paused, glancing at her, saying if her grandfather passed away, there was no longer any benefit for her, so he understood her frustration. Her frustration boiled over, asking why point 0. 5 had to be removed, and he replied it was unnecessary, simply leaning closer, his smirk deepening as he asked what she thought he would do to her, or he paused, his gaze piercing, asking if she was afraid of being swayed. Her cheeks flushed with anger as she glared at him, saying fine, she gritted out, crossing out point 0. 4, but point 0. 5 stayed, she would modify point 0. 4 instead, and handed him the revised agreement. He read it aloud, not sleeping in the same bed. Yes, she replied firmly. Sol asserted that their marriage was business, not emotional. All right. Without further argument, Jin Young grabbed the paper and signed it. She watched him seriously before saying he should close his eyes once he was done. He frowned slightly, confused, asking why, but before he could process her words, he noticed her leaning toward him, her eyes closed. He froze, his mind racing. She opened her eyes slightly, realizing his hesitation. Flustered, she grabbed his cheeks, saying sorry, she forgot to take off her hat, she was just practicing the wedding kiss. Before she could finish, he reached out, removed her hat, and tossed it aside. In one swift motion, he leaned in, cupping her face, murmuring a wedding kiss, his voice low, adding that it was initiated by the groom. Her heartbeat quickened as he drew closer, his gaze locked onto hers, her breath hitched as he pressed his lips to hers, the kiss deepening as they both became lost in the moment, realizing its significance. As the days passed and the wedding day drew closer, Yoon-sol's phone buzzed constantly with updates, bookings for venues, arrangements for the ceremony, and countless details. She visited each place with Jin Young's mother, whether it was shopping for their bedroom, tasting wedding cakes, or trying on wedding dresses. One afternoon, as she slipped into her wedding dress and stood before the mirror, a wave of realization hit her that this marriage, though a contract for mutual benefit, was still very real. She stared at her reflection, her emotions swirling. The ceremony was set to take place at their family home on Dodge Island. Walking through the garden, she noticed the flurry of preparations, the decorations, the flowers, the tables being set, but she couldn't understand why she didn't feel happy. Inside the house, her aunt approached her with a concerned expression, asking where Jin Young was, as she hadn't seen him yet, and sighing that he should be there by now. Hearing those words, a pang of unease struck Yoon-sol's heart. An emptiness she couldn't quite define began to settle over her. Suddenly, someone called her name. She turned toward the door, and there he was, her husband-to-be standing with his luggage, his face calm but welcoming. Relief washed over her as she saw him, her heart unexpectedly lifting. Noticing her expression, Jin Young walked over gently, taking the box she was holding, apologizing that he came without letting her know. Before they could continue, her aunt appeared, and Yoon-sol quickly introduced her to Jin Young. As her aunt and Jin Young chatted about the upcoming ceremony, Yoon-sol's gaze lingered on him without realizing it. A smile began to form on her face as she felt a genuine sense of calm and happiness. At night at the Choi house, everyone gathered around the dinner table, casually chatting. Yoon-seo's aunt scolded her gently that she needed to eat more or she would faint on her wedding day. Yoon-sol protested that she couldn't eat too much or her dress wouldn't fit. Jin Young, sitting nearby, interjected with calm assurance not to worry, and, after they were married, he would make sure she ate plenty. Yoon-sol nodded, and her aunt smiled warmly, commenting it was no surprise that Yoon-sol said she fell in love at first sight. Hearing this, Jin Young raised an eyebrow and turned to her, asking oh really, she never told him that. Her grandfather chimed in with a chuckle, saying that was just how she was, she didn't always say what she felt, but she would love him wholeheartedly. Later, as Yoon-sol prepared a room for Jin Young, he entered with his luggage. Glancing around, he asked if this was her room. She replied yes, and she would sleep in her aunt's room tonight, adding hesitantly that if this felt uncomfortable, she was sorry. He replied simply that it was fine. She asked softly why he hadn't told her earlier he was coming, she would have prepared a better room for him. He looked at her for a moment, then raised his hand and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, saying because his future wife didn't bother contacting him the day before their wedding, what else could he do but come find her himself? Caught off guard, she looked at him, and he smiled faintly. She thanked him sincerely for coming.